the world. This is part two, part three, however you want to consider it, depending upon if the original you want to say zero or one. We have a little bit of a time crunch to do this in because I misunderstood the time. So we're going to get on to talking about pinball and Sega and how they developed in the 40s and 50s. Of course, I'm Slacker Kite. With me, as always, we have Brian Wonderboy, the hotness on the mic. How you doing, buddy?
I am doing well, and I appreciate the compliment. My mic is very hot, and my mouth is very chilled from this kombucha that I am drinking. It's very nice.
Nice. I imagine that works well against the heat wave that we're having in the U.S. right now. So,
Motherfucker, it's been over 100 for like 3 straight days here. It's stupid.
fuck off. Anyway, when you first recommended us talking about pinball, now I knew we had to kind of cover this era, but then you're like, oh yeah, there's this whole history of pinball and it getting banned, and I'm like, pinball? Like, when I think of pinball, I think of the nicest, most corny, cheesy game you can possibly play. To know that it has like this history of considered to be a hooligan game that robbed children of their pennies is frankly
Yeah,
goddamn amazing.
I know. Like to know like the history of pinball, if your only experience is with like the Elvira machine that was at that one bar in Atlanta for a while. It's you might be surprised to learn about like the history of its ties to like gambling and the mob, and
Yeah.
like like one of the law officials or government officials like literally throwing pinball machines into into a river.
So last time we were going to go back to the 40s, back to the time Turing and Stree are still working on developing their AI to play chess and all that. And I want you first and foremost to. We're going to talk a little bit about this History.com article written by Christopher Klein. I had some other information from other places, but I want you to consider the pachinko machine first, because I
Ooh.
think you have to have that in mind before you think about how pinball was seen, because they both came from the same thing, right? They both originated out of the um, Bagatelle game. So they both have that same origin involved. Yet, when I say pachinko, you're thinking about gambling. At least, Asian markets are usually thinking about gambling when we're talking about pachinko. And if you're not familiar with pachinko, you're launching a bunch of balls, depending upon how much money you put into the machine. It launches them, the balls bounce around, and they can potentially land in different places. That's pinball. That's the basis of pinball. Um, and they both have exactly the same origins, but somehow our pinball machines ended up looking dramatically different from a pachinko machine. I hit edit on the title and it didn't save. Thanks, John, for highlighting that.
Good catch.
Let me go ahead and update this. Sorry for my clackety clack ass keyboard here.
That's how you know it works, though. If you can hold tempo on your keyboard, that means you saw a keyboard.
Anyway, so that is how pachinko came about. Was it's basically uninvolved, other than it's much lighter and brighter, and you got more boops and beeps going on. A pachinko state game is still a pachinko game, and thanks to wow, I actually forget who wrote this particular article, and it doesn't say directly on the page. However, Yeah, you do get kind of an idea of the beginnings of pachinko from this, and these were the earlier ones from the 40s and 70s. Obviously, they're more involved now, much lighter, much brighter, much bigger, but they still follow this same idea. You're shooting a ball, you hit into a hole, and depending upon the particular hole, you get different prizes. That is pachinko. So with
Yeah,
that,
and
yeah, go ahead.
oh no, sorry. I was just it's interesting to look at the humble beginnings of this, knowing what we know as pachinko. It's the same way that as most people view pinball now, and they look at pachinko. We joke about it all the time. When you look at Konami's library, it's literally just pachinko, and like so, it's always curious to see like even the beginnings of these, like how they're tied together still in that gambling route.
Yeah, and back in ye 40s, pinball was still pretty highly tied to gambling. You didn't really have the flippers. The flippers, in fact, came about because of that tie to gambling. And at the time, Americans were involved in the 40s in what you would call a progressive movement. Now, when you talk about a progressive movement, you're thinking now and inclusiveness and all this. They still wanted to bring in immigrants in the 40s. That was how they shored up their economy and all of that in America in the 40s. But we don't want those people bringing in their own native, how they feel. We want them to be American. We want everyone to be American. And how do we make everyone American like we are? Not, American in a broad sense, but we want them to be like us. Education. So we're going to educate them, and we're going to learn them a Bible, because that's America. But PTAs and churches across the country started popping up saying that the kids were all spending their times down at the Midway, throwing away all of their pennies on these games of chance, and that it was making juvenile delinquents, and that it would rub off on the rest of our immigrants as well, and we would have a derelict society. I am not making a bit of that up, and that's...
Well, no, I mean it's I don't think anybody would doubt that you're making that up, considering how attitudes towards different forms of media still are around today when it comes to these sort of things that maybe are like new and evolving as compared to other forms of media, a la video games. And we see the violent video game argument come back up all the time, even though it's been thoroughly debunked so many times, and how video games are debasing today's youth and blah blah blah, and none of it ever sticks, but it always is a talking point within these circles.
Yeah. And it doesn't help as well that a lot of pinball machines both came from Chicago, where the mob was, and some of them were mob fronts. Not even a lie there. And as well, you had a lot of these pinball machines at burlesque places. You had people getting drunk and horny and shooting off the pinballs.
In more ways than one.
Mm-hmm.
Hashtag THOTW.
THOTW. So, whereas pachinko was, embracing the gambling side of it and maybe a little bit seedier, pinball really did not want that image of it. And one of the more interesting videos that I have found here discussing this history.
Winning was just fun.
Thank you, advertisement. And boy, this, for the amount of work this man put into this video, Pinball Panic by Arcadeology, only 400 views, is just a fucking travesty, because it really goes in hardcore to discuss how everything happened. Everything checks out versus several things that I looked up, and especially the history articles, several books, and other information. And it is kind of astounding that um, that they were literally breaking these things apart. And to give an idea, in 1935 money, in just New York City, pinball was a $35 million industry. That's 1935 money. So this was not something tiny. This was a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
So what we have to talk about is Mayor LaGuardia, the famed mayor of New York City and one of the big leaders of the progressive movement. And yeah, he swept into New York City on this same platform of progressivism. We're going to clean up the city, we're going to educate our children, and we are going to make this city the best city in the world. And in a lot of ways, he did. And he had some very hard-line tactics in order to do that. The first time that Mayor LaGuardia really started trying to get rid of things that were considered seedy and contraband was 1936. He rounded up, this was, directly after the Prohibition era, but he was trying to basically still get rid of alcohol from the city. So he went to all of the speakeasies that were popping up, got rid of all of their alcohol, and that included their pinball machines. Took the whole thing and set it out to sea for a fucking Viking funeral for a bunch of pinball and booze.
Yeah, I mean, he ended up him and a bunch of police officers took axes to I think roughly 2,000 pinball machines, and then threw the remnants onto a boat that sailed out into the Long Island Sound, and then just dumped it all. Fuck your shit, fuck your fun, and in the process made pinball way cooler.
Yeah, pinball is an agency against the man. Can you... That's amazing that pinball somehow became kind of an underground seedy thing that, only the hipsters were able to do in their, illegal establishments.
I mean, I love pinball being an integral part of greaser culture.
Now, that part where pinball kind of entered into the whole, greaser culture, is more the late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah.
And a lot of that came in January 21st, 1942. So setting the idea for why LaGuardia was able to get this pitch to really go after pinball. Like, the first one was just getting rid of it as a matter of side note to getting... an attack on all of these places of sin, as they would call them. In January 21st, 1942, he had made a huge pitch that directly after Pearl Harbor happened, that we were in need of all of the metal and wood that we can possibly get our hands on, and these pinball machines are nothing but metal and wood used to rot the minds of our children. We got to get rid of them. And the people were behind it. Of course, the shop owners of candy stores and other things that used pinballs to get some foot traffic weren't huge on it, but it still went over big because America. Fuck them people who did the Pearl Harbor and all that. And it's estimated between 2,000 and 3,500 pinball machines just in New York City were all chopped up and thrown into a huge public bonfire that day on January 21st, 1942. Just... that is the strangest pitch I've ever heard. We have to get rid of pinball. because we need wood and metal, so we're going to burn it all.
I love that, like, all of the pinball machines that they ended up destroying and confiscating, and like basically scavenging materials for wartime manufacturing from, and during the course of all of that, that was specific to LaGuardia's actions,
Mm.
um, basically was enough reportedly to build 4 2,000-pound aerial bombs. So they did all of this and got 4 bombs out of it. Which,
uh,
granted, I'm sure bombs are way more valuable, like, to a military force back then as opposed to now,
mm,
obviously. But still, like, you did all this
4.
public spectacle for 4.
They also took a lot of the wooden legs from the pinball machines and fashioned new billy clubs for the police officers. So for
Because of
years,
course they did.
they had pinball leg billy clubs that the officers were using. And I mean, on one level, I'm kind of amused, but on another, that's dope as shit. I want a pinball leg billy club too.
So in that way, is LaGuardia's Vice Task Force here the first U.S. Army esports Twitch channel?
I think you're not far off. And this was
Using the means of this culture to defile the culture?
yeah, just use the culture to take care of the culture. Good times.
Jesus.
And this was 25% of the pinball machines registered in New York City at that time. And it didn't stop at New York City. Many other cities, including Milwaukee, Chicago, New Orleans, and Los Angeles, all followed suit. And this forced pinball for a long time in America's major cities to be the underground thing we were talking about. Like, greasers played a lot of pinball because it was seen as tough and anti-establishment because it was against the law in some places. And that is my favorite item of this whole thing on pinball, though, was the 1960 presidential election. One of the things that Republicans tried to smear John F. Kennedy with at the time was that John F. Kennedy happened to work as a silent partner with some people that sold pinball and took a photograph with these pinball manufacturers. And they tried to use this to tie John F. Kennedy to the mob. Of all the things you could use to tie John F. Kennedy to the mob, it was his tie to pinball manufacturing that got him in deep water during that 1960 election.
That's just so odd, yet I completely get it for the times. You know, it's one of those things that I can look through the hourglass and see why that would be such an issue then.
Mm.
But throwing the hourglass aside and putting on like modern lenses, not even modern lenses, like 1980s lenses, and just looking at that is like, how did this get to this level that it could be a political controversy in that way?
Yeah, because, you had these mob ties to this gaming device. So, hey, it's a very soft sell. Pinball to mob to JFK, okay. There you go. And that is how it was sold at the time. Now, by the 60s, people had kind of chilled a little bit on it. It wasn't quite the same, like, shock that it was in the, the heyday of American Reformation in the 40s and 50s. And by the 70s, people were caring a lot less. And it was 1974, specifically, that pinball was officially allowed back into California. And I actually kind of love how they did this. Let me take this a little back here. The Amusement and Music Operators Association came before Congress to talk about their games, and Congress was, saying this is a game of chance. They had added flippers in the mid 40s to pinball to make it less of a game of chance, but it was still largely seen, even in the 70s, as that game of chance, despite the fact that pinball manufacturers had worked so hard to try to reform this image with your flippers and your gates and your bounces and all of these different items within the pinball game to make it more of a skill-based game, because there was still that initial skill shot that had to take place. So one of the top players, Roger Sharp, came before Congress and said, I am going to pull this plunger and I am going to manipulate it in such a way that it goes down this exact alley and it will do exactly this, and I could repeat that every time. And Congress compared it to Babe Ruth calling the home run in that one famous game. He pulled back the plunger and did exactly what he said. And that was basically the end of it. Sharp said to them, look, there's skill, because if I pull the plunger back just right, the ball will, I hope, go down this particular lane, was the exact quote.
I had not heard this story before. This is very interesting to me because I want to know more about this, the entire, like, what all happened during this hearing. Because, like, yes, it's very interesting to note that they brought in one of the most skilled players in the world in Sharp to display how pinball is a game of skill in that way, and how there are different strategies and different, player inputs that manipulate the game, as opposed to the game just, playing itself in that way. But I also really hope that they let Sharp display his skills and then just turn to the Congress and just be like, yo, y'all want to try? Come over here, pull that plunger, see if you can do it.
Sadly, I don't have the details. I did look over a few newspaper clippings, and they largely focused on Sharp because, it's kind of the spectacle of the event.
Oh, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And so in 1974, that was when the California Supreme Court ruled that pinball was more of a game of skill and chance, and it was overturned. But it was 1976 that New York City finally allowed pinball back in. And that wasn't just because, we want to be a little bit nicer and allow people to have their own freedoms. No. In the 70s, there was a bit of a recession going on in America, and large cities were finding themselves very short on money. New York City, for instance, really was very low on money. So the reason that New York City really overturned this law was so that they could put a $50 license fee on every machine that went to New York City, and make some money. And they made hundreds of $1,000s in the 70s on license fees to pinball machines.
I mean, it's a smart strategy for trying to, I guess, break down the regulation around it in that way. Like, if you're one of the easiest paths for any kind of legislation to be pushed through, that can radically change something, or the acceptance of something socially or even politically, is financially based. As much as it frustrates me to say that, I mean, we see the same thing with how marijuana has been decriminalized over the past 10 to 15 years in this country, because there's a lot of money in it, and a lot of, like, stuffy white dudes who basically jailed a bunch of black and minority people for marijuana charges are getting in that business because they realize how much money's in it. You know, like it sucks in that way, but there is some good that comes out of it. Um, because we do see something like pinball actually have an industry get rebuilt around it and see it begin to flourish again.
It's ironic as well that in the mid 70s was when pinball came back into the mainstream and was largely allowed and legalized again. Considering that was when video games shot off, that was roughly when Pong took place, and it had a moment in the sun before it all got taken away.
Mm.
And there is your history of pinball just leading up into that history where it crosses over from gaming in the popular way, going from mechanical to video.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's ask a question of what was selling at that time. Another really good YouTube video I came across while reviewing this, and yet again, for the amount
Petco.
of
Sorry.
for the amount of work Genovi put into this video, 13,000 views seems real low for this amount of work, but a whole lot of interesting work. We're going to talk about a little company out of, hilariously, New York City called the Irving Bromberg Corporation. And they were distributing Baffleball, largely. You may remember Baffleball as one of the original Bagatelle games. And they expanded to distribute more and more of these devices. In 1940, Irving and his son Mike, who later named himself to Martin Bromley, as well as their friend James Hubert, moved to Hawaii and started a company by the name of Standard Games. And you may still be like, what are you even talking about all of this for? Hawaii was a huge military base at the time, and what they wanted to do, instead of selling direct to the population, their Baffleball games and whatnot, which were going largely out of style, especially considering what Mayor LaGuardia was doing, he could sell these to the servicemen. And, you know, all of these penny slot games and pinball games and what have you can all be sold to the bases for off-duty servicemen to play. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and oddly enough, they really fucking took off after Pearl Harbor. Especially considering that they were based in Hawaii. That, you know, this idea that we need to pay more attention to our servicemen. So, at that time, in 1945, they rebranded Standard Games to Service Games, and threw their whole lot and caboodle behind the military entirely. Service Games, longhand for Sega. But then the Johnson Act of 1951 happened. What the Johnson Act said was that you cannot put games of chance, into military bases in the U.S. So what Sega did was they made a distribution place in Japan, and largely catered to Asia through Japan. So that was how Sega Japan was born in 1952. They did have other headquarters as well. By 1953, they had a Panama headquarter, but they were in Korea, the Philippines, and South Vietnam as well. And they distributed games like the very popular slot machine, the Diamond Star, was really their big hit. And they made a fair amount of money doing this. there's a lot of other things that really happened to Sega in the 50s. That company really, really exploited loopholes in foreign markets in order to do what they did. One of the more one of the less how to put this, because it's kind of seedy what they did.
Oh, you're telling me a company that put their headquarters in Panama is seedy? Huh?
No, not at all. What they did was they would manufacture the initial parts in Japan, and they would devaluate the cost of the parts in Japan. They would then take it to America in California to finish building the machines and overvaluate the parts that were made in California. This allowed them to perform legally as an American company, despite the fact that most of their manufacturing took place in other parts of the world. That they were able to state that we are doing most of our work in California, despite the fact that if you really looked hard at the books, they were dramatically overvaluating the work they did in Japan and undervaluating the work they did in California to distribute worldwide. And this got them in a lot of trouble. And they weren't just into the pinball stuff now. They had bowling alleys. They had light gun ranges. They had a lot of stuff going on in the 50s and 60s. And the Senate looked into Sega over fraud corruption in the 50s. They were found to have paid all of their taxes and but it was through multiple loopholes that they were able to say, here's how we did our taxes, everybody. We did this clean across the board. And somehow, this one Navy serviceman happened to get bribed for $50,000, but we're not involved in that. We didn't make the bribe. Someone must have done it on our behalf.
Not a valid defense.
No tie was ever able to be found directly back to Sega itself. So, it'd be kind of slander, honestly, to say directly that Sega bribed this serviceman to, turn a blind eye to some of their operations, but it's still kind of smelly. But because of all of this, and their, nervousness about Sega and whether or not Sega was actually following the Buy American Act, they were cut off from Japan at the time. So that is how Sega of Japan and Sega of America became two separate companies. And Sega of Japan had to start doing their own thing. It's also worth noting that the Sega of America decided to attempt to go into the European market through Italy by making Sega SA, which for short they would call it Sonic.
No.
Yeah.
No. I thought Sonic only came into the picture in the 90s.
Nope. Came about in the 50s. Sega of Spain was known as Sonic, so that was their European import division.
And
it was
pretty edgy.
Largely Sega of Japan that was manufacturing their highest selling items. For one, Periscope was their first real electronic mechanical game. Now, Namco had put out Periscope originally in 1965, But Sega did their own thing in 1966 with this, and instead of just having a Japanese market, Sega of Japan took this worldwide. It's a fairly straightforward game where there's electric boats moving back and forth, and you have a little periscope, and you have to aim your periscope, and the lights go down the alley, mimicking a torpedo, and then there's explosion noises and whatnot once your torpedo hits that boat, making it Sega's first electronic mechanical game. But yeah, there's largely largely mechanical, but still that's how they broke into that market, and it wasn't a huge hit, but it did decently until they put out another game along the similar vein called Missile. And this one was a much bigger hit with the airplanes flying around, and you have a radar device that would mimic planes, and you would see lights and sound of those planes going down. You would track missiles on an LCD screen, and missiles and planes moving around inside the cabinet were all mechanical. This game cost a whole quarter to play, which was unheard of in 1960s times, but you can imagine how much stuff was moving in this machine.
Just looking at it, like, it's one of those machines that it's hard for me to, without actually like being in front of it and putting my hands on it, it's hard for me to really like feel attuned to how I would play it at first. Yes, even in the video that we have here, they're showing the operating instructions there. It's just, wow.
Yeah, so with doing, it really did wow the people of the 50s. And they continued to make games that largely worked around this idea. So you had stuff like Periscope, Jet Rockets, Killer Shark, and my personal favorite, Duck Hunt. Duck Hunt was originally a 1968 Sega game where you had a realistic as fuck looking rifle over here.
Yep.
And ducks flew around, and you got 10 shots to shoot down the ducks that were flying by, using it was a light gun game. And this went over huge, especially in America. The hilarious part was in the 50s to 60s, Sega of America declined. By the time that video games started to become popular, and this was 1973, that Sega made a Pong clone called Pongtron that took off like gangbusters. Sega of Japan was largely the ones distributing it, but they needed to be able to get it into American hands. Well, there was just good old Mike, the son of Irving, who founded Sega. Martin Bromley was his name, and he just basically had a small office left, and that was all that was really left of Sega of America at the time. And they used this to build Sega of America back up again to sell Pong. So everything from Sega to Pinball to what was being developed in labs, it's so fucking weird that literally everything starts to converge towards Pong. The episode 0 we did with the first official, what we would call a video game console, Fairchild F, the stuff that they were building in labs, your tennis for two. It is bizarre how all of it manifested together what we think of the modern video game industry exploded because of Pong. The Pongtron from 1973 was what made Sega of Japan have to revitalize Sega of America and then start manufacturing games.
It's crazy. I mean, obviously, I think anybody that has really delved into this stuff before, like, understands the importance of Pong, but this really underlines it like 5 to 10 times in that way, just to see how, like, every company like saw that game as its lifeblood in some ways, and really was the jumping off point for all the different things that delineated from it.
Mm.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
so when somebody says Pong is the first game, they're not entirely wrong, because it was the first major commercial success. And we'll get to that in a few more episodes. The next episode we're going to do is definitely going to be the brown box.
Ooh.
Yeah.
This is one that I don't know a ton about. So I'm familiar with it, but I'm curious. I'm very, very curious to learn more.
Yeah, admittedly, the brown box is usually where I usually start when talking about video games, but I do feel like giving everyone a bit of a precursor on pinball, on the history of the Midway, the penny arcades, etc., and how games became where the 25-cent slot came from. It came from games like Missile, made by Sega. Where did pinball flippers come out of? Pinball flippers came because they didn't want to be gambling machines anymore and seen as games of chance in Puritan America. So that all converged into making this thing that was where video games started to launch off, beginning in the mid to late 60s. It didn't really take hold till the 70s when a company called Atari really hit big, but there you go. This is the end of the prehistory. I would still mark the brown box as prehistory as well, but there you go.
No, it's rad. And I'm excited.
Cool. So we will be back on September the 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern. 8 p.m. Eastern. 8 p.m. Eastern. And
Yes.
we will discuss Ralph Baer's Brown Box then. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and have a great day.
Bye.